Well, I think we'll get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. I love our weekly chats. I'm gonna start by, as usual, offering a land acknowledgement, the place where the Clay Studio stands and where I sit today, even though I'm not in my home. I'm still on part of the traditional land of the Lenni Lenape. We acknowledge the Lenni Lenape as the original people of this land and their continuing relationship with their territory. In our acknowledgement of the continued presence of the Lenape people in their homeland, we affirm the aspiration of the great Lenape chief Tamanend, that there be harmony between the indigenous people of this land and the descendants of the immigrants to this land, as long as the rivers and creeks flow and the sun, moon, and stars shine. Again, we're recording just for anyone who's coming in late. So I'm gonna offer these introductions to both Karen and then to Jane. Karen Patterson joined the Fabric Workshop and Museum as their inaugural curator in July 2019. Prior to this appointment, she was the senior curator at the John Michael Kohler Art Center. Over the past 7 years, Patterson has curated over 50 exhibitions, including major exhibitions such as Ray Yoshida's Museum of Extraordinary Values, Ebony G. Patterson, Dead Trees, several critically reviewed site-specific installations such as Joy Beasley and Paul Swenbeck, Philadelphians, Dr. Charles Smith and Heather Hart. Her focus on JMKAC was also geared toward the curation of the Art Center's premier collection of folk art, self-taught art, and artist environments, work that culminated in a multi-tiered collaborative 2017 collections-based exhibition series, The Road Less Traveled, which received praise from Hyperallergic as the year's top exhibition. Congratulations, that's so exciting. She completed her BA in Folklore Studies at Memorial University in Newfoundland, Canada, and her Master's of Arts Administration at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. So I also want to add there that Karen, we are so lucky to have her now in Philadelphia. She's an incredibly generous colleague across institutions. And yeah, it's been really wonderful to get a chance to work together on this project. I had a teeny little part. So thank you, Karen and Jane. Jane Irish's paintings create confrontations and coexistences, realms of history that rarely collide. I'm going to read this because I think it's really important for people to just get like a base of what her work is about. Okay. Often employing the traditional medium of egg tempera, an ancient technique used in wall frescoes and illuminated manuscripts, Irish's paintings fuse energetic images of sumptuous interiors with inscriptions of colonialism and resistance. Remember that. She incorporates imagery from her travels abroad to historic sites and buildings, where she paints on-site alla prima and interweaves labyrinthine spaces with war motifs and poetry from Vietnam War veterans. In 2005, she organized the exhibition Operation Rapid American Withdrawal in response to the invasion of Iraq, which included works by over 80 artists. Alongside her prolific painting practice, Irish creates ceramic vases that further explore questions of beauty and violence and the construction of historical meaning through decorative patterns and traditional forms. Jane received her MFA in 1980 from Queens College and exhibited at venues including Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, Institute of Contemporary Art, the Walker Center, Delaware Center for Contemporary Art, and many more. She is the recipient of Pennsylvania Council of the Arts grant and Paintings Fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts. And her work is in public collections, including at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and PAFA. And I would just like to say Jane is she has an incredibly expansive mind, and it's as if she can see physical threads in the universe that connect seemingly disparate issues.
Thank you.
Welcome, ladies.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm going to start by asking the question that I often ask, which is, why and how did you make the brave decision to make your life in art? And I think we decided yesterday I was going to start with Karen and then switch to Jane. So have at it.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for that introduction and for the collaboration for our hardcover exhibition. It's been lovely to work with you, and yeah, I feel equally as lucky being in Philadelphia at the Fabric Workshop. And your question prompted a lot of thoughts, and especially for someone working on their thesis right now, I didn't have a clear path that would end as a curator. As you mentioned, my undergrad was in folklore, and I became really interested in folk architecture in undergrad, all these kinds of sea shanties and houses and boats that fisher people would make to signify their home that differentiates from another person's home. So I got really interested in that idea. I also got really interested in ghost stories. For those of you who don't know Newfoundland, it is an island, and it is, and the fisheries was really the main source of income for many years. But there's also a mining history there, and a lot of the ghost stories and folk tales have to do with the land, because they're so familiar with the ocean and fishing and understanding it, that a lot of the kind of cautionary tales come to do with land and forest and where the things they don't get to survive. And I got really interested in that. So there's one thing. Then I have this other skill that I'm very good at Excel spreadsheets and policy. So that didn't feel related, but I was hired early to in Halifax, Nova Scotia, to work on their public art policy. And through that idea, I realized that many people relate public art to monuments and historic kind of concrete marble statues. And I knew that Halifax is a really great, vibrant art community, and that there could be another way to describe public art. So I initiated a 12-hour festival that had artist commissions and temporary public art. And so it was a way to get people understanding that there's different ways to think about publics and art, but then it would go away. So if we offended anybody, it would go away. We could get all the feedback, we could understand how it goes, and then we could build a policy based on the reaction to that event. The event is still going on to this day, which is really exciting. But through that idea, I found out of all these kinds of sites in Halifax, historic sites, that I could start small artist residencies. That was through that festival that I found all these unused sites. So I started this small residency for artists, which then led to artist homes and how artists live, and artist studios. And so then when it was time for grad school, I selected a grad school that had a focus on the context of art making, and especially when it comes to homes and studios. And SAIC has a study collection for Roger Brown. And so the Roger Brown home and studio in Chicago, you can go visit his home and all the art that he surrounded himself with, and how he lived was important for me. And my thesis was on Roger's professor, Ray Yoshida, who's a painter, and he had just passed, and all of his contents of his home were in storage. And so my thesis became, how do you build a story through someone's home? And through then, I have been constantly thinking about the context of art making, and how we can understand art through the ways in which artists live and work, and how can we support that to create better systems, but also better ways in which artists can feel experimental. So that, I mean, it wasn't a path so much as like one thing led to another. I can see it in hindsight, age gives you that wisdom of seeing the connections. I didn't know it at the time, but I'm grateful for it.
Yeah, wow, that's so great. And it's a winding path. It's just that you didn't know what the goal was, whereas you didn't know what the destination was. Yeah, and that's what I hear from almost everybody who answers this question. It's like, I had no idea that I was going to get interested in this or that, and you sort of let the world. You work really hard, and you have good ideas, and think deeply, and you'll sort of be led forward. And we've never talked maybe this deeply about those original impetuses for you. But it's interesting because I have the same kind of early, for me, it was going to period rooms and historic houses, but that was where it was like, oh, we can understand the world and people by looking at where they lived and how they lived and the objects they chose to live with. It's really invigorating to me. So
same. And there's so many great houses and studios in Philadelphia too. So there's so many great different ways that institutions, organizations support different ways of making. So it's really exciting for
Yeah.
me being so,
Oh,
yeah.
that's great. Well, and Fabric Workshop itself, in a way, is like which I'm sure you've already thought about deeply, but having been founded by Kippy Stroud, and just it was her environment. She made it, and she gave artists the place to create their dreams. So that's pretty amazing. Yeah.
And it's such a unique, I mean, for me, the draw was that there was a studio within the museum, that there was going to be making happening at the same time as presenting, just as such a unique, and a collection to kind of recognize other ways of making and historic ways of making. You just don't see that anywhere else. So I was really excited.
Although I think I might hear some people say it's a museum within the studio, not a studio within the museum.
Totally.
Right?
And that all of those things are true. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And just to that end, on July 22nd, our Lunch and Learn will be with Emily Zilber, who's the curator at the Wharton Esherick House, and Roberta Massich, who just completed an installation of her work, intervention into the house. So that's going to be exciting. Great. Thank you. So I'm going to switch over to Jane, and you have to unmute yourself. I just thought I heard some feedback before, so I turned it up. There you go. Yay.
Okay. Wow, that was amazing, Karen. And I realize how much I have connections with you and Jennifer talking about house museums and decorative arts or historical installation art, really, or something. I think when I was coming of age in high school, junior high school, it was in the 70s. And I like to say everyone I knew was going to be an artist, because it was like the Vietnam War period and aftermath. And there was a distrust of the regular paths through life. And so art was sort of a lot of my high school friends went to different art schools, and I would say that maybe I'm one of the ones that stuck it out. So there's different turning points, that make it so it's not like one point you do it and you're so excited about the way your body feels when you do it or something like that. And then there may be disappointments, but then there's positivity, and then there's different like turning points as you go, I think, that made me stay. But recently I did a podcast with about kind of like this subject with Tom Judge, has started one, who's a Philadelphia artist. Yeah. And I was thinking about as a similar, like there's certain things that happen. Like I had a 6th grade teacher that recognized that I was more of a visual person. So she would bring in like chess, like Bobby Fischer's chess manual or something. And it was like reading symbols instead of reading text. Mm-hmm. And people helped me along the way that way. And I've always like sort of tried to be around people that excite me or have a story. And this is why I've stuck with sort of I think of myself as a history painter often, that I have stuck with a sort of build up and aftermath of one war, but it's kind of like a myth that extends to all the tribulations we have, I think. And one of my mentors is a poet and anti-war activist, W.D. Earhart, and he always he points out that I made a big mistake deciding to be an artist, or on the history of a sort of activism, I love that's what we do. We make these jumps to make bigger mistakes, and and you just grow that way, and feel like you're getting into new territory and have something to say to people that's new. And so
I love that you
Uh,
said that it's a series of decisions. And of course, that makes perfect sense. It's really not one brave decision. You kind of have to wake up every day and decide again, like, yes, this is what I'm doing, because it's not easy. It's a path that you follow
yeah,
because you feel like you have to, not because it's
yeah.
like this easy, fun
And
thing to do.
sometimes you search out things to support yourself too. And when you're talking about house museums, I totally was like a docent,
Oh
you
yeah.
know, in historic houses. That was like a job, and working in auction houses, you know, just putting yourself around the kinds of objects you need to know, and in sort of creative ways, or being around working with foundations. I did that, and got to know a very wide discipline of artists in Philadelphia, and am able to sort of believe that everything can be cross-disciplinary, because you get to know them. You know, you get to know people that are that relate to your work, and they aren't necessarily painters or ceramicists, and I love that.
That's a really good point too, that
Yeah,
you have to put yourself
yeah.
in the places where you're gonna get to learn from the objects that excite you, and then
Mhm.
yeah, not limit yourself. I feel like we talk a lot about self-care these days and like learning to say no, but there's also a moment when you kind of just have to say yes to everything for a while, I think, just to because you never know which thing is going to lead to the next exciting thing. Where were you at docent? I want to know which house.
It was a house museums in Maine. I would work in the summers. It was the Emerson Wilcox House and the old jail. And it was American, you know, collection. It was like a tavern and a house, sort of an established family's house.
Mm.
Yeah, and I discovered like kinds of artwork. There's a kind of artwork called mourning art, you know, that is mourning, like crying. That is was I saw that was, a lot of them were needlepoint. This form was either done in silk painting on fabric or needlepoint or needlework somehow. And it's like 18th century artwork and early 19th century. But it was done by women. And so I thought, well, that's cool. You know, there isn't that much. It was kind of difficult to, when I was coming of age, to see a lot of women's art in galleries. So I thought, oh, well, here's some, you know, I'm working as a docent, and here's some women's art. And so I would use that as a sort of a launching point for some really funky paintings of people crying over sort of op art and male sort of abstract pillars or whatever, you know.
Yeah. Wow, that's great. I have to go back and look at some of that other work of yours. And also they were using hair, not just needlepoint, right?
Yeah.
And that, you know, that, of course, that question that Linda Nochlin posed, why are there no great women artists? And we all know the answer is there were great women artists, but they weren't in the marketplace.
Yes.
They were making art that wasn't being sold. It was gifting and in the family. And so they didn't get recognized. I mean, one of the many reasons. I love that.
Yeah, and then
conversation go ahead.
Another main source for me, a house museum like that is like a small scale, but definitely the Frick had a huge influence on my work and on my ceramic work. Like I was trying to make French porcelain that might be in the Frick collection, and panel painting, and it represents a sort of class structure, and and an object can do that, and a contemporary artist can source that style and have, you know, indirectly commenting on what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, your piece that when I was at the museum, and the piece that was brought into the collection during my time there, I was so excited to be able to connect it to a real person who was in Philadelphia, and I'm pretty sure it's a reference to a Sev what is it, a ewer maybe, and you were painting images of like everyday contemporary life onto these forms, and it just really was the first time that I saw that collision of contemporary and historical. So exciting. But yeah, great. Okay, so now we're gonna talk with both of you at the same time about, or Karen can talk first about her inspiration for this particular exhibition, hardcover, and how that evolved. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and I included some slides at the beginning just to kind of talk about just what I mean, or how I feel when I say art environment, and that I think the Fabric Workshop is an artist environment. This is what we talked about just earlier. This was one of the first projects I worked on when I was a curator at the Kohler. And in the center, you see Rei Yoshida's objects lined up just as he would have had them in his home. I segmented out his home based on a floor plan that I drew, and then kind of overlaid it into a gallery. And so in the center, you see the objects, and I had historic photos so I could recreate exactly all the objects. And there's kind of tchotchkes. There's also Chicago Imagist work in there, so that his students, and there's things that he would have picked up at like flea markets in Chicago, and textiles and things that he would have picked up on his travels. And then on the side walls, you see his work. And what I was trying to convey here is living like this creates work like this. And I thought that that would be something, you know, the idea of like being a historic painter, Jane, I really relate to, is that I think there's always something that we can, if we bring it forth in a way that feels contemporary, people can start seeing a long arc of understanding and and so that was the kind of idea here, is showing that how artists live can be a direct connection to how they work. So that was the first project that I worked on at the Kohler. And then the last project is the next slide. As I was thinking about other artist environments, this is an evocation of Lenore Tawney's studio. And I work very closely with the Lenore Tawney Foundation. And this is a major retrospective of her work. And I used historic photos to do this evocation of her studio. But I think the studio is as equally as important as the home, as a museum, as anything. And so again, there's some, and actually another moment of joy is you see Toshika Takaezu's work in her studio to talk about friendship and how that can also be a very important context to art making. And it's also Toshika's birthday today. So I just like a nice connection. So this was the last project. And so thinking about at Kohler, and so then I was thinking about how excited I was to go to the Fabric Workshop and think about the artist studio, and knowing that I will be within so many more artists working together as colleagues, and then also supporting artists in residence. And so when I was thinking about the Fabric Workshop, I was just thinking about the space first, and hoping that I could develop a new curatorial framework that would suit the mission of the Fabric Workshop. So the first thing that you might encounter when you go to the Fabric Workshop is wallpaper, and you may walk right by it. But if you don't, you'll see that the wallpaper was made by Viola Fry. And I was really interested because I had known Viola Fry work as ceramics. And so I really wanted to, oh, I don't know. Yeah, this is a great, so that's the wallpaper that you might see when you walk in. And so I got to thinking about the idea of, what does it mean for an artist to change processes, and how can that build out their context of art making? And especially knowing that Viola Fry worked in such large scale, and that I can only imagine that adding wallpaper to that made that you could get even more space, you could take up even more room. But as you look at the details of the wallpaper, you can kind of see all her inspiration. So you can see images of tchotchkes, and this wallpaper is called, and my colleagues on Fabric Workshop can attest to my lack of memory of names, but I think it's Artist Studio World. And if Christina Roberts nods or at least chimes in, okay, good. So that was like exactly the inspiration of Artist Studio World. And that's exactly how I feel, that there's artists, there's a studio, and then there's the world. And that's how do we convey that thought? So that was the kind of seed. And we have these beautiful screen printing. They're amazing if you show them to an artist. Artist Studio Mind World. Thank you, Christina. And I when you show artists the screen printing tables that you'll see in Jane's slides later, it really does take your breath away as the possibilities of how much fabric you can make. And I wanted to see if that invitation is still as exciting as it was, you know, in the 70s and 80s and 90s for Viola and Betty and Toshiko. And so we started this kind of inaugural, this is Betty Woodman working on her piece. And again, what is screen printing do to ceramics work? And if you go to the next image of Betty's work, you can see that screen printing provided beautiful framework and kind of this a next, like almost like a doubling down of the joy of decoration and pattern. And so how can screen printing do that when clay can't, or can they complement each other? Just these kinds of questions that you have. And I also really felt like that the Fabric Workshop collection is just full of these tests and experiments, and how can we bring these tests and experiments into invitations to contemporary artists. And so the premise was, with the title hard/cover, how can a change in process bring about growth? And this was, of course, in 2019. So the question has changed over the past years, as we all feel like we've grown in ways that we didn't expect to. But the opportunity to screen print did bring about change for the artists in our collection, Betty Woodman, Toshiko, and Viola Fry. And I feel like as we invited new artists like Jane and the other artists in the show, that it also brought about growth too. So I just want to talk about this project right now, if we can, because I'm just following your images, Jen, so it's really exciting. But this is Toshika Takaezu's work, and this was a collaboration with the Toshika Takaezu Foundation. And what is so exciting about collections work when you also have a residency is that you can reach out to these foundations and say, hey, we have these works in our collection. What do you have in your collection that could tell a bigger context? And in this case, you see these, what we refer to as the soft moons next to her ceramic moons on the ground. Those are the works from the Fabric Workshop collection. And I had known Toshiko's work. I learned about it through more deepening with Lenore Tawney's project, but I also only thought of her in terms of ceramics and that bright blue color. So to learn that we had soft moons in our collection really kind of told me that I was on the right path. First it was Viola Fry, then it was Toshiko, and I was like, okay, so change in process does bring about some level of growth. So these are the soft moons here, and on the wall, you'll see these monoprints next to that beautiful weaving. And the Toshika Takaezu Foundation didn't know about the soft moons in the Fabric Workshop collection. Those monoprints were made in 1977. And they were brought to the Fabric Workshop. Toshiko brought them to the Fabric Workshop as kind of, this is what I'm thinking about to make fabric for these soft moons. But this was 20 years later. So the monoprints were made in the 70s. She came later, 20 years later, to the Fabric Workshop. And so then we have this arc of making, you know, and I just thought that was so exciting. And so like in this little vignette, in this tableau, you can see these dots connecting, and you can see that a change in texture and pattern can really just be enough to bring about growth for an artist, because we know Toshiko's work as kind of a meditative process, as a way of being present with your work. And the same thing happened with the soft moons, and the same thing happened with the monoprints 20 years prior.
I just want to add that, to me, it just hit me as you were talking that the idea that she made the monoprints, came back 20 years later, and here we are, whatever, 30 years after that, 40, I don't know, 30 probably. The arc of the Fabric Workshop itself has now allowed for these three artists who have since left us to be, you know, the remainder of their activity at the Fabric Workshop is still there to be seen. And so you have the best of both worlds of this historic museum and these historic actions, and you still are working with contemporary artists and allowing that to continue. And, you know, we can now project ourselves 40 years into the future to see what's going to happen with these collections and things that are being made right now. I mean, it's really mind-blowing. actually, because even when I
Yeah.
was there for like 6 months in 1999, no, 2001, it still felt like everybody who had been working, like everyone was still alive, right? I mean, and here we are 20 years later, and like that first generation isn't with us anymore.
I
So
know.
it's really made this big leap, just like in a temporal sense.
Well, and that's what the beauty of this exhibition is. Thank you for saying it that way, Jen, because one, it was a collaboration with the Clay Studio and you, and like, so you and I can talk about change in processes as well as people, as curators, as like people who are interested in supporting artists. And speaking of like that fast forward in time travel, I didn't have an image of it, but when you come and see the show, you'll see Shino Takeda's work. And she's a Japanese American living in Brooklyn, and she had always heard about Toshiko, but had never seen the work in person. And so then in seeing the collection as we, toured her through the facilities and showed her the screen printing and things like that, in her installation, you may remember this, Jen, but there's these beautiful moons that are hanging from
They're
ceiling they're just little beautiful kind of charcoal colored moons. That was a way for her to pay tribute to Toshiko. So it already has happened, fast forwarding again, just by artists looking at artists, and that was pretty amazing. Yeah.
I don't remember if you have another slide. Oh yes, well, perfect. So then we can segue into this. I was so honored that Karen asked me to think with her about who could be in the show, and of course Jane Irish came to my mind immediately, and that was really nice for me. Thank you again for including me in that.
Well, it's so fun, and I think it was. And what's great about you, Jen, is like I can just say, should we collaborate on this? And you'll just say, yeah, we should. And we don't have to worry about like why or like what it's going to mean. And we just went for it. And I wanted to learn through you about what it means to work with clay in Philadelphia. And then you introduced me to Jane. And so this installation is kind of pretty amazing that way. And I also want to obviously hear from Jane about the project, but the behind the scenes kind of like, the word collaboration can be thrown around a lot, but what it means is really just two people willing to figure it out and knowing that working together will make something better. And that's just what it is. And that's a very, and that it translates into support for a Philadelphia-based artist is even better. So we didn't really know what Jane was going to do. Jane knew what she was going to do, but that didn't really matter to us. And so I love that very much. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks, Karen. We can all three kind of talk together, but Jane, do you want to now go ahead and tell us a little bit about how you felt when Karen invited you and what you imagined?
It was so, I was thinking, what day did we meet? And it was February 14th, 2020. So right before the pandemic, we did a studio visit together at the Crane, which I had a studio there. And it was so exciting to have, definitely I've used, I was just coming off of doing this piece I did in Fairmount Park. It was part of with Philadelphia Contemporary, and it's called Antipodes. And I did this, the Lemon Hill Mansion has 2 oval rooms, which are very unusual architecture. We all know it driving away from the art museum down Kelly Drive. But it did have the downstairs, which is the next slide, had used muslin fabric and painted it with distemper, which is a glue, it's a theater paint. So I was already coming, and the whole piece itself came off of some ceramic works that I had done that were also in the show of bowls representing Antipodes, which means 2 sides of the earth that are directly opposite each other. So it would be like Vietnam, Peru, or France, like Australia, and America, like Philadelphia, the Indian Ocean near Australia. So, and I had made these bowls and sort of flipped as like a a globe cut in half and flipped open. And so I was already like diving into fabric and ceramics as a source of creativity, and to have you there and encouraging a new piece, it was so exciting. And the other important part, which is still in the new piece at Fabric Workshop right now, this was based on not only the idea of antipodes, which I gleaned from reading a cosmological essay that Edgar Allan Poe wrote in, it's like 1847. And it predicted the Big Bang. So, and in fact, if you're reading the New York Times and the Atlantic right now, a man who was advising me on, while I was reading Eureka, has just published a book. It might be in your brain because you've heard a lot about it. But Poe wrote this cosmological essay, which speaks of the spirit and the origins of the cosmos, and an expansion of material and a crunch. So it's not only the Big Bang, but it's like a big crunch. And he called it a poem rather than a scientific proof. So at the time he was writing, right before he started that piece, he was living in Philadelphia too. So I had based this kind of new myth on not only the history of Philadelphia's anti-war movement, but also an earlier cosmological scientific creation that came based out of Philadelphia. But now I'm showing you my expansive threads that I put together to make my artwork. But yeah, so I think of the Fabric Workshop piece and the Clay Studio as another model of the universe. And I think what came to me the most during this, which I realize the more I speak about it, is the air that is between the objects that I never really thought about before. The objects themselves are what I call potpourri, which is based on 18th century sort of French, very high style decorative art. And here's my studio. During the pandemic, I was working on a little farmhouse out in York Springs, Pennsylvania, and now I've built a studio there. But so they're reminiscent of ships, and they kept like spices, and they represent the spice trade, and an object that would be in a super wealthy person's home, or commissioned as like an elaborate art piece or something in the 18th century. But they held spices, so it represents the spice trade. And also it became, during the pandemic, kind of the idea of air moving, the danger of this air moving. But the imagery reflects upon colonialism and the movement of the horrible histories of movement of different material and human suffering, but also sometimes just pure decoration of different places. So it might have Sicilian mirrors, and this is the next stage after making the objects in the studio. I'm China painting them, and the one on the right is the image is the man upside down. It's Alexander de Rhodes, which is the character who brought Christianity to Vietnam, and a Jesuit priest who brought this new culture and manipulated it later on into, it became like French Indochina. But I represent the portrait upside down, and as a, to let the audience know that there's something wrong with this picture, but they're very elaborate, and it was really cool to work as a collaboration with Karen and Jennifer. I remember when we were setting up, when we were talking about these pieces over Zoom, we were talking about how would we represent them. And I remember Karen suggesting like the low table as kind of an altar. And we also talked about how kids could see things. I remember a series of murals I did where children and friends would say, that was the first time my kids were able to actually get involved in looking at the painting because it was hung so low. But just like different, slightly subtle ideas like that about like the height of something we talk about, and it becomes an altar.
Yeah.
Or and working with Nami and Zach, and who are at the fabric workshop, trying to figure out the hanging of the fabric. The fabric is based on the painting I showed you earlier called Cosmos, which is definitely sourced out of Edgar Allan Poe. But
this one.
It's a simpler, a simpler, the fabric is a simpler version of this. And actually that painting's in the show at PMA right now called New Grit, if people want to see it.
I'm so sorry, I meant to add that to your bio.
Yeah.
That's right. Everyone go see New
cool.
Grit.
It's cool.
So
but
important.
It's what it does is represent the background. The blue is a representation of the cosmos of Vietnam. And it's kind of, it's like looking at a rice paddy and seeing the sky at the same, in the reflection. And this is, it's such a beautiful idea.
Yeah, that's amazing.
It just, you're not sure if it's water or sky. And then the holes in the fabric, or the holes, the bluish greenish color, or no, it was the purple color in the fabric, are images of the anti-war movement, that Vietnam veterans against the war. So it's like a Tiepolo hole punched through the water and reflections. And it was so wonderful working on such a large scale of it, and then using it as a ceiling, as a billowing kind of a sail form on the ceiling we came up with too, working with Nami. And I wanted it to feel like a outdoor fête galante, like a French theater outside. But it really was different once it really became this representation of the air moving to me. And it makes me think of a poem I used to or part of the Quran I used to say to myself as one of my meditations, which had something to do with knowing that the bird's wings, Allah is holding up the bird's stretched out wings. And it's like the God is holding up the sky, instead of a European idea of God looking down on us, and judging us or something. So it made me reflect on those ideas again. And it's also kind of like taking a giant installation, and I knew the next piece I wanted to represent in a gallery. So it's like 10 feet by 10 feet, 100 cubic feet of space that you can like sort of take your giant idea and try to like bring it into a funnel or hourglass form too. But the air is just something I continue to think about. It's like started with this piece, and
that's great.
It's really cool working with Corinne too, doing the tile pieces. I had gleaned kind of like Elizabeth Key, who's now at the Fabric Workshop. I love her sourcing of the meaning of repetitive patterns and like where they come from. And we all do that as ceramicists. But I had been in Madrid, and I've always looked at Goya because of the content of my work. But I realized looking at some archival photographs that there's this wallpaper pattern that was in the farmhouse where Goya did his black paintings. And some of that wallpaper came with the paintings when they were being restored or whatever. And this pattern of my floor is based on that. So I call it, so the whole piece was called Goya's Dream, just thinking that, you know, you're starting with this pattern that represents, to me, the horrors of war, you know, or the black paintings, and then acknowledging that through the ships, and then trying to let go and find a peaceful solution or a peaceful hope. And this very much goes along with Edgar Allan Poe's essay too, because it ends like with this ecstatic, hopeful experience reading it. So hopefully that, I mean, the whole piece itself is very beautiful, but the outcome, I hope, is the solution of this peaceful acknowledgement of Indigenous motif and the anti-war movement in a historic commemoration. Those two things together as like the sky. So
well, it does feel hopeful. Yeah, because like you're saying, you know, if nothing else, you're forced to look up.
Yeah.
Right.
There isn't, I mean, it sounds so simple, but when you walk through the gallery, there's great things are high, but you know, usually in museums, you're not looking at the ceiling, even though in you know, palaces and churches, there's often something on the ceiling that you need to look at. But I think it's particularly poignant for your themes, Jane, that the viewer has to look upwards and think about that, because we get, you know, we're so earthbound usually. But when you physically lift your head, you have to kind of think about the sky and think about the fact that everyone in the world is looking at the sky and can see the sky. And it is a unifier as well. I'm so excited about this Edgar Allan Poe text that I haven't gone out to actually get it yet, but it was published in 1848, and there's so much stuff that happened in 1848. Like Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, the gold rush started, the women's movement, the Seneca Falls Convention was in I mean, there was something happening in the cosmos that year that just made people have these intellectual
That's really cool.
I don't know, it's a really once you start hearing about it, you're gonna like notice that when you read something, you're like, oh my gosh, that was 1848 too. Anyway, it's my favorite year.
Right.
So.
It's like 68, right?
Yeah, a lot.
Right.
It's like things, all the worlds collide at the same. Yeah. Hopefully we're moving into that again.
Yeah.
That would be nice. Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that, both of you. I'm gonna remind everybody if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm gonna stop the share. Did we wanna, I do wanna acknowledge out loud that my colleague Corinne Kula helped Jane with firing these tiles and kind of testing the different China paints to get the right color. And then Karen's colleagues who are always integral in this, but maybe just 1 minute between the two of you of this idea of the screen printing. Because Jane, have you done screen printing before?
I mean, just a little. I actually did a piece with Nami a really long time ago, for the Philadelphia Print Festival.
Philographica?
Yeah, Philographica. But I've tried to use silk screen in paintings before, just the text to have it very crisp and sitting, you know, instead of hand painted. So it was great to work with on this scale. It was like really amazing. And with, yeah, I definitely felt one thing that I've repeated a few times, but Zach explained that the whole room is going to become a color after, it just bursts.
Yeah.
The printing 19 yards of fabric, filling a room with color was just like really a beautiful moment,
Empowering.
Yeah.
Wow.
And just figuring it out to have it the most clear, and the color, working on the color palette with him.
How did you choose those two colors?
I mean, they have these books you just go through and pick out colors. I knew I wanted the effect to be blue, but then you go from, the two sides of it, analogous harmonies of
like antipodes.
Yeah.
Of color. That's fun.
And
Karen, do you have any thoughts about the sort of watching Jane transition to screen printing, or thinking about that?
Well, thinking about the antipodes idea too, which was new to me, but there was a new process that happened with the screen printing too, that you kind of move the screens around in ways as kind of refracting, as opposed to keeping the screen the same direction the whole way down the table. Jane had the idea of shifting it around, which again adds to the multi-perspective that you see, and then even more powerful once you realize that it's going to be on the ceiling. So then you kind of feel like you're almost absorbed, those kind of beautiful frescoes in that way. Really effective in doing that too. Yeah.
Yeah, there wasn't a gravity. It wasn't like a wallpaper, there was a gravity because we knew it was going to be on the ceiling. So then you could spin the screen, and just seemed intuitive. Sometimes I even do that in my studio. That's what's really cool about that body of work, is that you don't need to work on scaffolding or a ladder. You can just turn the canvas and work on it, because it's doesn't have the gravity. It's meant to be looked up at.
Yeah, that's so interesting.
And then just to quickly talk about the wallpaper, especially our shared interest, was like how all these kinds of ideas come back to the idea of home too. Like that the wallpaper came from the home, this big idea of kind of war and destruction of war, but you have to remember that all this happens on an individual kind of intimate level, that we're processing all this information, whether it's about air circulating in the last year, or the destruction of war in your case, Jane, or there's, we have all these kind of big ideas have to come through as we're sitting in our home, no matter what age, what decade, what era, that we still have to be at that domestic intimacy level. And that's where screen printing is so effective in telling that story, because these are such domestic materials, whether it's your teacup that you're sitting with, or your tablecloth, or these things that have this resonance of comfort, is really, and so that wallpaper choice was really brilliant.
I love the fact of decorative arts being a record of thought, and to me it represents a record of what the high art was like 15 years earlier. So it's a record of or the culture was at 15 years earlier. So it's a record of expression of what our society believes. So if we make it to be forward thinking, but at the same time look like it's established, then we can grow, we can go to the next level. And I don't know if I'm making it clear, but I love that it's like a record of the old in a way, and we live with it. And what if it was more futuristic, and I let go of the atrocities, and just assumed that we were finding a resolution, and making that our record. So
and that's why.
So not only domestic, I think of it as like futuristic or spiritual or something too.
And aspirational, I think, is another word that would
Aspirational.
say what you're, if you describe your work to someone in words, it can sound so horrifying, but your work is never, when you experience it in person, it isn't. It's hopeful and trying to take the negative and remind people that we don't want that and that we should be moving in the other direction. And
I never really paint images or put on of the war itself. It's either before or after, or the resistance to it, and or trying to find a reparation, you know, and it's not directly the what Goya would do, or something. It's more aspirational or veiled, you know. See, it's oftentimes veiled, but there's a story underneath that I'm trying to make reparations for myself and others through it, through beauty, really.
Yeah, that's a great way to say that. Did you want to say something, Karen?
No, I just think that the show does talk about whether it was intended at the beginning, but just how strong beauty can be. I think it's a very objectively beautiful show, and that sometimes beauty gets associated with being frivolous. And I don't think, and just hearing Jane talk and looking at the contents of the show and what artists came up with, both past artists in residence and current artists in residence like Jane, you can tell that there's great strength in picking aesthetically pleasing, beautiful things. So
yes.
Yeah, right. That's how you attract people and can tell them the story. You know, you have to get them there. You have to look long enough.
Right. Like my friend again, W.D. Earhart says, you get them any way you can, you know, and through beauty is a good way to do it.
Yeah.
Like to tell a message. I mean, that's what we do. We're explaining or mirroring or helping people.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's artists and curators. And I think it's another goal of mine through our Lunch and Learns is to highlight the important work that these forward-thinking curators are doing too, like Karen, to match the amazing work of the artists like Jane, to get people to look and help them look, and through that make the world a better place. So I think congratulations to your post. The show is amazing. I hope everyone either has seen it or will go see it soon. And thank you, Jane. Thank you, Karen. Thank you to our guests.
Thanks.
I hope everyone has a great day. This definitely was my highlight. So thank you.
Me too.
Thank you. Thanks to the Clay Studio.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Have fun in all your travels. Bye, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.